The Adirondacks were wrapped in an early morning hush, the kind of silence that settles thick over the forest before the world fully wakes. Mist drifted low between the trees, weaving through tall pines and oaks, softening their outlines until they looked like pale ghosts in the half-light. The air smelled of wet earth, pine sap, and the faint trace of last night's rain still clinging to leaves. A lone hunter moved along a narrow, nearly forgotten trail, his boots crunching damp twigs and sinking into patches of moss that muffled most of his steps. He wasn't in a rush, he rarely was on mornings like this, preferring to let the woods speak to him in its own quiet language. Beside him trotted his dog, a sturdy brown retriever with ears perked and nose to the ground, sniffing at every branch, root, and faint trail of scent. The forest felt older here, almost untouched. Sunlight hadn't yet burned through the heavy fog, so visibility was limited to a few dozen feet. The hunter adjusted the strap of his rifle across his shoulder, his other hand resting lightly on the leash even though the dog hardly needed it. Every so often, the hunter paused, listening to the rustle of something small darting through underbrush or the far-off call of a crow echoing against the mountains. He'd been in these woods countless times, but there was something about this particular morning that seemed heavier, charged in a way he couldn't quite name. The dog's breathing was steady, rhythmic, until suddenly its pace quickened. Its paws patted faster against the damp ground, tail wagging not with playfulness but with intent. The hunter noticed, raising a brow, watching the animal's head jerk side to side as if catching something on the air. They moved deeper into a section of forest where the trail broke down almost entirely, swallowed by roots and moss. The hunter muttered softly to himself, his breath visible in the cool morning air, remarking on how strange it was that his dog seemed to have found something so early in the hike. He didn't know it yet, but these first few steps into the mist would set the stage for a discovery that would haunt the quiet beauty of the Adirondacks forever. The dog froze mid-step, its body stiff and ears forward, a low growl rumbling deep in its chest. The hunter stopped too, tightening his grip on the leash instinctively, though the animal had already crouched low to the ground, fixated on something he couldn't yet see. The fog swirled lazily between the trees, making every shadow seem alive, every stump look like something more sinister. The hunter whispered the dog's name, but the animal ignored him, nose pressed firmly to the earth. Then, with sudden urgency, the dog began pawing at the damp soil near a cluster of moss-covered rocks, claws scraping against roots and stones as if it had caught the unmistakable scent of prey, or something far stranger. The sound was raw and insistent, the rhythmic thud of paws against earth echoing louder than it should in the quiet woods. The hunter's pulse quickened. This wasn't how his companion usually behaved. Normally, when the dog sniffed out a rabbit or squirrel, there was a playful energy, a wagging tail, eager glances back at him. But this was different. The dog's tail was stiff, its growl low and warning, a signal that whatever lay beneath the soil wasn't game to be chased but something to be revealed. The hunter crouched down beside the dog, brushing damp pine needles aside with the back of his hand. At first, he expected to find an animal's burrow, maybe bones left behind by a fox or coyote. But as the dirt loosened and the moss peeled away, something unusual began to surface. His eyes narrowed as faint edges of fabric appeared, frayed and discolored, almost blending with the soil as though the earth itself had tried to swallow it. The hunter hesitated, his breath catching in his throat. The forest seemed to still around him. No crows, no rustling leaves, only the sound of his dog digging deeper, more frantic now, as if driven by an instinct stronger than obedience. The hunter's heart pounded against his ribs. He could feel the weight of something unspoken in the air, as though the Adirondacks were holding its breath, waiting for him to uncover a truth that had been buried too long. The soil gave way in uneven clumps, damp and heavy with the night's rain, until the dog's claws struck something that wasn't rock or root. The hunter leaned closer, brushing dirt aside with careful hands, his gloves quickly darkening with mud. At first, he couldn't quite place what he was looking at. It was soft, knot-like stone, and as the fog shifted above them, a muted patch of color emerged beneath the grime. His breath caught when he realized it wasn't just dirt-stained fabric but something once bright, maybe blue or red, now bleached pale and tattered from years underground. He froze, the weight of recognition pressing against his chest. He pulled a little more earth away, revealing a strip of cloth tangled around what appeared to be laces, thin, brittle laces that once belonged to a shoe. It was small, far too small for any hunter, hiker, or adult who might have wandered through these woods. The edges of the sole crumbled under his touch, rubber worn down by time, yet unmistakably shaped like the kind children wore. The hunter stared at it for a long moment, his thoughts colliding in a rush of disbelief and dread. The dog barked sharply, startling him, and continued to dig along the edge where the fabric disappeared deeper into the soil. More scraps surfaced, fragments of clothing so frayed they looked like cobwebs clinging to roots. The hunter's stomach tightened. This wasn't the forgotten trash of some careless camper. It was deliberate, hidden, as though nature had been trying all this time to keep the secret buried. He pulled his hand back, dirt falling between his fingers, and sat back on his heels, staring at the shallow hole forming before him. The world felt suddenly too quiet. The morning mist pressed in closer, thick and suffocating, and the air seemed colder. His mind raced with questions, the most chilling of all being who this belonged to and how it ended up here, deep in the Adirondacks where few people ventured. The dog pawed once more, whining now instead of growling, as if it sensed the shift in its master's mood. The hunter wiped the mud from his gloves against his pants, his face pale. He had stumbled onto something he wasn't prepared for, something that wasn't meant to be found by chance on an ordinary morning in the woods. And though he didn't know it yet, this small, weathered shoe would reopen a story that had haunted the region for 2 long years. The hunter's hands trembled as he brushed away more of the loose earth, his fingers moving with both hesitation and urgency, driven by a mix of fear and morbid curiosity. The fabric was no longer just a vague scrap, it was clearly part of something once whole, a garment torn and broken down by time. He swallowed hard, the sound loud in the silence, as the soil crumbled to reveal the object fully, a small shoe. Its surface was cracked and faded, the stitching frayed, but the outline was undeniable. It was the kind of shoe a child would wear, simple in design, now warped and misshapen from being trapped beneath the ground. He lifted it carefully, almost reverently, mud dripping from its sides. For a moment, the hunter didn't move, just stared at the tiny relic resting in his palm. Memories of his own children flashed unbidden across his mind, shoes scattered by the door, muddy footprints after a day of play, laughter echoing through the house. The comparison made his stomach twist. Whoever had worn this had been no older than his youngest once was. The hunter felt the weight of the discovery pressing on him, heavier than the rifle strapped across his back. Beside him, the dog whined, pawing at the ground again as if urging him to keep going. The hunter lowered the shoe and leaned closer to where the soil had broken apart. That's when he noticed something else. Tangled between the roots and the damp moss was a lock of hair. At first, he thought it might be animal fur, but as he leaned closer, the strands glistened faintly in the muted morning light. It was unmistakably human, light brown, brittle with age, still clinging stubbornly to the earth that had tried to hide it. A shiver ran through him, crawling up his spine. His breath came shallow and quick, his heartbeat hammering so loudly it drowned out the forest itself. He glanced around, half expecting to see someone watching, though the fog only offered him empty silhouettes of trees. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the woods were aware of what he had just uncovered and were holding their breath with him. The hunter drew back, one hand gripping his dog's collar to steady himself. This wasn't just a lost item, not something misplaced by a careless traveler. This was evidence of something darker, something tragic. He knew these mountains carried their share of unsolved stories, whispers passed around campfires and in roadside diners. But never had those stories clawed their way into his own reality like this. As he stared at the shoe and the faint strands of hair, a dreadful certainty settled in his chest. This discovery wasn't random. It belonged to a mystery that had never been solved, a disappearance that had left the Adirondacks haunted for years. The hunter's breath grew shallow as his eyes locked on the strands of hair tangled in the soil. For a long moment, he couldn't bring himself to move, his hand hovering just inches away but unwilling to touch it. The realization struck him like a blow. The forest had kept this hidden for years, sealed beneath layers of moss and rain-packed earth, and now, by chance, his dog had pulled it into the light. He felt his knees weaken, sinking slightly into the damp ground as he steadied himself with one hand against the rocks. The dog shifted uneasily beside him, no longer growling but letting out short, sharp whines that cut through the thick silence of the woods. Its ears twitched at sounds the hunter couldn't hear, the kind of restless energy animals carried when they sensed something unnatural. The man felt it too. The air around him seemed to change, the kind of change you don't see but feel, heavier, colder, charged with a weight that pressed down on his chest. The mist above them moved in slow coils, and suddenly the forest seemed different. Every creak of the trees, every drip of water from the canopy, felt amplified, almost watchful. He thought of the countless times he had walked these trails before, carefree, focused only on game. Now it was as if the woods themselves had closed in around him, the ancient pines leaning closer, their shadows stretching like long fingers. He stared again at the shoe resting beside the shallow hole, then back at the glint of hair caught between the roots. His mind raced, trying to deny what his eyes were telling him. It could have been anything, old clothing abandoned by a hiker, a trick of the light on a tangle of animal fur. But deep down he knew better. There was a story buried here, one the forest had tried to swallow whole. His mouth felt dry as he whispered to himself, words that never fully formed. He thought about the news stories from a couple of years ago, the mother and son who had vanished without explanation during what was supposed to be a simple hike in these very mountains. No trace had ever been found, no trail, no belongings, nothing. Until now. The dog let out a sharp bark, breaking his spiral of thought, and pawed once more at the soil. The hunter pulled it back quickly, his hand trembling as he gripped the collar. He didn't want to uncover more, not yet. His body screamed to retreat, to put the earth back the way it was and pretend he had never seen any of it. But his heart told him it was too late. What had been hidden was no longer hidden, and he was now part of the story that was unfolding in the Adirondacks, silent, mist-laden morning. The hunter sat back on his heels, the damp moss soaking through the knees of his pants, but he hardly noticed. His eyes stayed locked on the small shoe and the faint strands of hair glistening in the mud. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called, its voice sharp and hollow, echoing through the valley like a warning. The sound tugged at something in his memory, something buried almost as deep as the shoe itself. He blinked, his thoughts drifting back to 2 years ago, when these woods had been alive with search parties, helicopters, and desperate voices calling names into the night. It had been all over the news, a young mother and her little boy gone without a trace. They'd come up here for a weekend hike, smiling in the last photo captured on a trailhead camera. After that, nothing. No tracks, no camping gear, no remains. Searchers scoured the ridges for weeks. Volunteers carried flashlights and combed through ravines, while locals lit candles in churchyards and whispered prayers for their safe return. But as days turned to weeks, hope had drained away, leaving only speculation and shadows. The hunter remembered the photos most vividly. The mother's face, bright eyes, kind smile, hair tied back beneath a hiking cap. And the boy, maybe 6 years old, grinning wide with missing teeth, clutching a toy car in his hand. The image had stuck with him, haunting even when he tried to forget. Now, looking at the fragile shoe in the dirt, the memory struck him with brutal clarity. This wasn't coincidence. The size, the placement, the silence of the woods, it all fit too perfectly. His dog shifted uneasily, ears flat against its head, as if sensing his growing dread. The hunter reached down, absently stroking its fur, though the motion did little to steady him. His throat tightened. He could see it now, the exhausted searchers shaking their heads, the boy's grandparents pleading on television, the endless speculation that maybe they had left intentionally, that maybe they had been taken, or worse. But here, in this quiet hollow of the Adirondacks, the hunter knew the truth had been waiting. He whispered into the fog, barely audible, "It's them." The words felt heavy, final. For the first time in years, the mystery that had hung over these mountains like a curse seemed to have an answer, but it was not the one anyone had prayed for. He realized with a sickening certainty that he wasn't just a hunter anymore. He had become the unwilling witness to the first signs of a tragedy buried in the heart of the forest. His hands shook as he fumbled for the small radio clipped to his vest, then thought better of it and reached for the cell phone zipped into his jacket pocket. The signal here was faint at best, but he had to try. His thumb trembled over the screen as he dialed, the glow of the numbers almost too bright against the dim morning mist. His dog pressed close against his leg, no longer restless but watchful, as though it understood the gravity of what its digging had uncovered. When the call finally connected, his voice cracked before he could steady it. "Sheriff's office. I think I found something. Out here in the woods, North Trail by Split Rock Ridge. It's bad." He swallowed, his throat dry as he tried to form the words. You need to send people. Evidence. Maybe, he broke off, staring again at the small, mud-caked shoe lying beside the shallow hole. Maybe remains. There was a pause on the other end, then the dispatcher's calm but clipped voice asking him to stay put, to keep the area secure, to wait until a team could reach him. He agreed, though his pulse hammered so hard it felt like the forest itself could hear it. He ended the call and shoved the phone back into his pocket, staring out into the fog where the trail disappeared. The hunter wiped his muddy hands on his jacket, leaving streaks that wouldn't wash out easily. He knelt again near the hole but didn't touch anything more, afraid that disturbing it further might erase what truth the earth had to offer. The silence pressed in around him, broken only by the sound of his dog's steady breathing and the faint drip of water falling from the canopy. Every minute stretched unbearably long, his mind racing through what the authorities would find when they arrived. He thought again of the mother and child, of the smiling photo he had seen 2 years ago plastered across missing posters at every gas station and grocery store in town. He remembered the vigils, the way neighbors clutched candles against the night, the way reporters had filled the streets until the story grew cold and they moved on. And now, here he was, one man and his dog, holding the thread that could unravel the silence. His dog suddenly barked, sharp and echoing through the trees, as if to remind him he wasn't alone. The hunter placed a hand on its head, grounding himself, whispering, "Help's coming." But inside, he wasn't sure if what was coming would bring closure, or only deeper shadows into a story the forest had held tightly for far too long. The stillness of the woods was broken by the distant hum of engines. At first, the sound seemed out of place in the deep Adirondacks, like something intruding where it didn't belong. The hunter stood, brushing the damp moss from his knees, his dog pacing in small circles at his side. The noise grew louder until flashing red and blue lights cut faint streaks through the fog, painting the trees in surreal colors. Moments later, the crunch of tires on wet gravel gave way to car doors slamming, heavy boots on soft earth, and the sharp crackle of radios. Deputies and troopers emerged from the mist, their bright jackets stark against the muted greens and browns of the forest. The hunter raised a hand, signaling them over, his voice low and unsteady as he pointed toward the disturbed ground. "It's there," he said simply. The officers exchanged glances before moving carefully, their steps deliberate, as though the woods themselves might swallow them whole if they tread too hard. Yellow tape soon stretched between trees, fluttering in the damp breeze. The air filled with clipped commands and the metallic clicks of equipment. Forensic specialists knelt near the shallow hole, pulling on gloves, their tools glinting under the pale morning light. With slow precision, they cleared away the soil where the dog had been digging. Bit by bit, more fragments emerged, scraps of faded cloth, tangled threads clinging stubbornly to roots, and then, something small, plastic, and rusted. One of the investigators held it up, and even from a distance the hunter knew what it was, a toy car, its wheels stiff with mud. The hunter's stomach lurched. His mind flashed to the photograph of the boy from the missing posters, smiling wide as he clutched the very same kind of toy. He turned away, pressing a hand to his mouth, the dog whining softly beside him as though echoing his unease. Around him, cameras snapped, evidence bags rustled, radios crackled with updates being relayed back to headquarters. The forest, once quiet and timeless, was now buzzing with the sounds of an investigation, a wound finally reopened after 2 silent years. The lead investigator straightened, his expression grim, holding up the shoe the hunter had first uncovered. His eyes scanned the circle of officers, and though he didn't say the names out loud, everyone knew what this meant. The search for the mother and her son hadn't ended 2 years ago, it had been waiting, buried beneath moss and soil, until this very moment. Word traveled faster than the mist could lift from the trees. By the time the evidence bags were sealed and loaded into the back of the sheriff's SUV, the news had already leaked into the small mountain town at the base of the ridge. Locals, still carrying the weight of a mystery that had lingered for 2 long years, began to gather in quiet clusters outside diners and gas stations, whispering the same question over and over: did they finally find them? The story spread with wildfire speed. Reporters, who had once filled the town in the days after the disappearance, now returned in convoys of news vans, their satellite dishes rising above the roofs like metal towers. Cameras clicked, microphones stretched forward, and the once sleepy main street became a backdrop for urgent broadcasts. The faces of the missing mother and son appeared again on screens, smiling, frozen in the last known moment of their lives, paired now with grim headlines about evidence unearthed in the Adirondacks. In the corner of a cafe, an older woman dabbed her eyes with a napkin, remembering the candlelight vigil she'd attended 2 winters ago. Across the room, a man who had volunteered in the original search shook his head slowly, muttering about the endless nights combing ravines only to come up empty. Parents clutched their children a little closer that evening, glancing at the woods beyond town with a mixture of fear and sorrow. For the hunter, it was surreal. He sat in the back of a patrol car, not under suspicion but because authorities wanted to keep him away from the swarm of press. His dog sat at his feet, tail curled tight, as he stared blankly out the window at the flashing cameras beyond the tape. He hadn't wanted this kind of attention, he'd only wanted a quiet morning in the woods. Now, his name would be tied forever to a case that had haunted the region. Back at the ridge, investigators worked long into the evening under floodlights that made the forest glow unnaturally bright. Every artifact pulled from the soil, every scrap of fabric, every rusted toy, every fragile bone fragment, was treated with reverence, sealed part of their secret. But as the headlines spread across the nation, no one could agree on the answer to the darkest question of all: what had really happened to the mother and her little boy in those woods? Floodlights hummed low as the last of the evidence was packed away, their harsh beams cutting through the trees like artificial moons. The once forgotten patch of forest was now scarred with footprints, tape, and the faint outlines of what had been unearthed. Investigators moved with solemn efficiency, their voices hushed, their hands deliberate as they sealed the final bags. Each one carried a piece of the story: fragments of clothing, the rusted toy car, soil samples, and bones so fragile they were handled as though they might crumble to dust. The hunter stood at the edge of the scene, his dog pressed firmly against his leg, tail low and still. He watched as the officers carried the bags to waiting vehicles, their boots crunching against the gravel path, their shadows stretched long and thin beneath the artificial glow. None of them spoke of closure. No one dared say the word answers. The silence that filled the gaps between their movements was heavier than the sounds of shovels and radios had been hours earlier. Above them, the sky had shifted. The mist that had clung stubbornly to the ridges was gone, replaced by a pale moon that lit the Adirondacks in a cold, silvery glow. It was a quiet too different from the morning. This was not the peace of untouched wilderness but the hush that follows when a secret is forced into the open. The hunter's chest felt tight, as though the mountain itself pressed down on him. He thought of the boy again, the photograph of him holding the toy car, his smile wide and bright. He thought of the mother, her arm around her son, their last recorded moment alive before the woods swallowed them. He had carried that memory like an old newspaper clipping, faded but still vivid in its sorrow. And now he had touched their absence, felt it in the brittle shoe, seen it in the strands of hair, breathed it in the damp air where the forest had tried to hide them. The dog gave a low whine, nudging his hand, and he realized he was still trembling. He pressed his palm into its fur, grounding himself in the warmth of a creature that knew nothing of mystery or tragedy, only loyalty. Engines roared to life, headlights carving paths down the trail as the convoy of vehicles carried the evidence away. The hunter remained, lingering on the edge of the trees, his breath misting in the cool night. He knew he'd never walk these woods the same again. Every creak of a branch, every rustle in the undergrowth would remind him of what had been found here, of the family that had vanished into silence and finally, reluctantly, been returned. As the last taillight disappeared into the distance, the forest reclaimed its stillness. The hunter stood beneath the pale glow of the moon, his dog beside him, and whispered a silent promise to the shadows, that their story would not be buried again.